Well, you mentioned the Nightingale, which of course, so many of our patrons and readers, all across the world, but here in Wenatchee and across our library district love that book so much. And it really is a beautiful, beautiful book, I must say. And I saw that it is back on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yeah, it and The Great Alone are back on. And I think what it is during this difficult time, people are turning to the books that they meant to read, that they've been recommended for a long time and they never got around to it. And they want to be certain that it will be a good read. It's the only thing I can think of because, it's strange to suddenly see it back on the bestseller list.
Yeah, that's great. Well, with the Nightingale, it may be in more people's radar too, knowing that there's a movie coming. Is that correct?
Well, COVID stopped all production. And so they were, filming in Budapest, and it got shut down in March of this year. So we have now moved from Christmas of 20 to Christmas of 21. But I will say it's a fabulous script, and the cast is really great. So I've got high hopes for it whenever it comes. Hollywood moves at a glacial pace under the best of circumstances.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about that whole process? It probably was optioned quite a long time ago. And then how much have you been involved in this whole process?
Yeah, it's been a long process. It was optioned before it ever even came out, which was interesting. So there were a couple of people who were really excited about it before it was even successful. And it sold to TriStar. And it's just been it took, I'm going to say 2 years just to get a script that was really, really great. And I think people can understand that, but the best way to put it is the book is 145,000 words and a script is 25,000 words. So it takes a genius, I think, to cut so much out of a novel and yet still try to hold true to what's important. And, so of course they're making some changes. I don't think they're making any changes that alter the message or the theme or the importance. What I really wanted to and found important was the relationship of the sisters going through this terrible time and discovering what they mean to each other, and female heroism, and in a male-dominated, time. And so I think they've got all of that. So fingers crossed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the stars, Dakota and Elle Fanning, I understand.
Yes.
That's a great cast.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Sisters playing sisters. So we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. So that book is such a great example of a wonderful World War II novel. And there's so many stories and books about World War II. Why do you think that is so common? Or why are people so interested in reading about it?
Well, the stakes are as high as they can be, and good and evil is clearly delineated. And so when you put those two elements together, I just think it's a potent combination both for readers and for writers. And because it's in the past and because we've digested and read so much about it, we bring something to the table as readers. We learn something, but we also know things that are beyond the scope of what the author has written. And so I think it allows us to both understand history, to understand our place in it, and while still being sort of pulse-pounding, thrilling, exciting, life-affirming, and life-risking all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, speaking of heart-pounding, Winter Garden was one that was absolutely gripping. And I wasn't expecting it to be gripping because it starts out, the setting is takes place somewhere around Wenatchee or Kashmir, correct?
Yeah.
And then it shifts. There's a whole other story that is so exciting and just a page turner. Can you tell us a little bit about how were you able to intertwine those two stories so beautifully?
That remains actually one of my personal favorites. I find the Russia World War II story so compelling and so interesting. And like Nightingale, when I stumbled upon it, it was a story that I hadn't heard before, the story of the Siege of Leningrad. And in my research, I came to the sentence, Leningrad became a city of women. And I just thought, oh, this is a story the world needs to know. But at that particular time, I was a straight up contemporary fiction novelist. I hadn't done a historical novel in years. And I was really concerned about writing a novel about the Siege of Leningrad, knowing how tragic the end of that is. And so what I decided to do was to, pair it with a contemporary storyline of two sisters finding out their mother's secret story. And because so much of the Leningrad stuff was just unbearably brutal, I chose the structure of telling half of it through a fairy tale to kind of soften it. And the reader then is lured into this world that slowly becomes darker and darker and darker. And by the time you get to where it becomes very dark, you're either all in or you've walked away, And so I liked that. And I think that I was trying to decide between setting it in Alaska and setting it somewhere here in Washington State, because Alaska, like Russia, has the white nights and the summer that goes on forever and the winter that's always dark. But I decided we have some very, very close friends that live in Wenatchee. And, we try to go to Wenatchee as often as we can to hang out with them. And we happened to be there in the winter, and I saw the apple orchards, and I thought, okay, this is it. This is my setting.
Yeah, cool. Coincidentally, last week, our author that we had on our virtual program was M.T. Anderson. I don't know if you know him. He writes for a lot of young adult books, but he was talking, and you might be interested. He was talking about his book about the Siege of Leningrad.
Oh, really?
And so, yeah. So our listeners might, be interested to know that, well, there's two books that really delve into it quite a bit. It really is an amazing, horrifying story.
It is. It's remarkable. And because it's Russia and because it was under Stalin, it's just, even researching it was difficult because, they held on to bad facts for so long and didn't allow anything to get out. And, people didn't write memoirs. And so it's now, I think, becoming more and more understood, which I think is, it's great because it's such a powerful story. And I'm sure like, World War II in other locales, I'm sure there are myriad stories from other parts of Russia during the war too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I was compelled by the character, the mother character, Anya, and wondered, where was your inspiration for her? Was there a real person at all that was inspired by that?
There were, no, the only time I've really written a novel that was inspired by a real person was The Nightingale. The Isabel character was inspired by a young Belgian woman named André Dujon. But Anya was sort of, she's a very different character for me, and she was very difficult for me to write because she was not a good mother. She was not a warm woman. She was not a warm mother. And it was, because she was so broken inside, because she had lived through such terrible times. And throughout the whole writing of her, I just wanted to say, wake up, look at what you've got, don't look at what you've lost. But I was really drawn by a lot of memoirs from women who had survived, terrible tragedies, losses of children, losses of family, that kind of thing. And I wanted to explore the psyche of a woman who was unable to forgive herself and the consequences of that.
So I'm curious about I think our listeners too would be interested about your personal preferences with reading and books. And so, maybe we could get some book tips from you, but what draws you to a certain book or certain authors, and who are your favorite authors?
My absolute favorite kind of novel is sort of a big, juicy, historical and contemporary epic that really makes me feel something, that really draws an emotional response and is beautifully written. And these are hard to find. A lot of books will do half or do this or do that, but to find it all together, I find it difficult. And that kind of book for me can be in any genre. It can be fantasy, it can be horror, it can be historical, contemporary, genre, literary. I would say some examples of this are The Prince of Tides, Shadow of the Wind by Carla Safone, who sadly just passed away this week, The Witching Hour by Anne Rice, The Stand by Stephen King, The Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter series. So I just like, immersive, emotional, well-written stories.
Yeah. And is it important to you that they are its own, they're in another place or in its own world?
Well, certainly points for teaching me something, something like, say, Shogun or Thornbirds or Kite Runner, So I think the kind of books that bring me to a world that I don't know, that's, super compelling. But I'm also happy with, a completely manufactured world.
Yeah.
Before this conversation started, we were talking about YA, and there are a lot of YA novels that are immersive and compelling and emotional like that, the Hunger Games series and some of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So who or, what has influenced your writing over the years?
Well, these kinds of books, which is, I think, what I've been working towards the last couple of years. I think Winter Garden was actually the start of me trying to write the kind of book that I particularly love to read. So bigger, historical, epic. But I have a very intimate focus in my work. I don't have the 15 characters. I have, one or two or three. So the authors that I mentioned, I would say Stephen King, Anne Rice, Pat Conroy, Carlos Safone. Who else? I love Alice Hoffman for her magical realism and some of the touches that she has. I love Donna Tartt, the Goldfinch. So I would say that I am most influenced by authors who are not afraid to deal in profound emotion.
Makes sense. So when you were starting out as a writer, or you had aspirations to become a writer, how did you go about making that decision? You were an attorney, correct? And then,
I was an attorney.
Yeah.
Well, this is a rather long story, but I'll try to be as brief as I can. I wasn't one of those people who ever wanted to be a writer. I never wrote, books or stories or any of that. I took a class at the University of Washington, a creative writing class. And they said on day one, once a week, you'll have to stand up and read your work aloud. And I dropped the class. I'm like, I'm not doing that. I'm not talking about writing. So it wasn't until when I was in my third year of law school, my mother was dying of breast cancer, which, ultimately led me to Firefly Lane 2 decades later. And I was complaining about law school, and she said, well, you don't really need to worry about it because you're going to be a writer anyway. And I know now, of course, with the benefit of more years on me, that she knew me well enough to know that this was where I was going to end up, because that's how we mothers know our kids. And I think, too, it was her dream for herself that she never got around to. And so she said, let's write a book together. And so in the last months of her life, I would go to the library and spend hours in the library. This is, of course, before the internet. You had to go to the stacks and stand there and go to the card catalog or whatever. And we decided to write what she liked, which was historical romance. And so we did all the research for this book. And then she passed away. So I just put everything in a box and put it in my closet and, went on with life. I was in law school, so I graduated, I passed the bar, I started working. And a few years later, when I got pregnant with my son, I had a difficult pregnancy and I was bedridden from 14 weeks on. And so, this was the late 80s. There was nothing on television. And my husband said, why don't you try that? Why don't you write that book that you and Sharon were thinking about? So I, pulled the box out of the closet and you had to buy a computer. This was like the dot matrix, days of, it was horrible trying to figure out how to work all that. And I just decided that I wanted to be an at-home mom and I would give myself until first grade. If I could sell a book by first grade, I'd be a writer. And if I couldn't, then I'd go back to the law. And I sold my first book when my son was 2.
Wow.
Long answer.
No, that's great. That's great. That's just what we were curious about. So what would you say is your most autobiographical novel?
Oh, Firefly Lane.
Firefly Lane.
That's the one. It's interesting, actually, because it's set in Snohomish, which is the town I graduated from, in my house, in my era, at the University of Washington, in the sorority, in the School of Journalism. It's just like my whole life. And it's because I hit a certain age, whatever year that was, and I was really, really missing my mom. And there's no way to go back. You go back through the boxes of photographs, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone. There's no pictures of her because she was taking the pictures, or if she didn't like the pictures, she threw them away. And so there's not this trail of her life. And my father, who's a wonderful man, isn't the best keeper of all of that, So I had to go in search of her a different way. And the way I decided to find her was to write a novel about a woman with breast cancer and how it impacted her dealing with her children and her life and how she felt about it. And it worked. It made me feel very close to her. It made me feel that I understood her. And I learned when it was all over that I had started the novel at the exact same age she was when she was diagnosed. And I finished it the week she died at the age. So it felt and does feel like she was sort of guiding me through all that.
Yeah. So since she was the one that kind of helped jumpstart your interest in writing, what would you guess would be one of her favorites of your novels? Are there any that you think she would especially enjoy?
Oh, I'm sure she's sitting somewhere with a martini and a red pen, waiting to tell me where I got it right and wrong. That's an interesting question. Nobody has ever asked me that. I mean, judging from her reading and what she loved, I would say probably the Nightingale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It really has that whole historical.
Yeah, I think she just would have liked that. She would have liked the sister. She would have liked France. She would have said, honey, we need to go to France to research this. You should take me along. I'm good at notes.
Absolutely. That's cool. Well, one of your books that I had only guessed that you would have had a lot of personal experience with to give you material was The Great Alone. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and your family story?
Yeah, it's funny. I always forget about that. It's brand new and I forget about it. I have been wanting to write about Alaska for years because in, I guess 1982, my father, who is an adventurer, who is still an adventurer, who is in fact driving to Alaska and camping along the way as we speak, moved, just went to Alaska, fell in love with the remarkable landscape and the people, and built what would become the family business, the Great Alaska Adventure Lodge. And it's on the banks of the Kenai River. It is just a spectacular place, one of my top 10 favorite places in the world. And the people of Alaska are so unique, and the lifestyle and the landscape, everything is so unique. So I tried to set Homefront there. I tried to set Winter Garden there. And what I kept finding year after year was that Alaska was too big and too strong, and my connection was too personal to have it be of lesser importance in a novel. It needed the space to inhabit a novel and to become essentially a character, which is what Alaska does in The Great Alone.
Yep.
And as a small aside, The Great Alone was the novel that I wrote following The Nightingale. And astute observers will notice that there was a gap between The Nightingale and The Great Alone, which is longer than anything I had had before. And the reason for that was when The Nightingale got ready to come out and then came out, the success of it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. And I was in the middle of a book that I had written specifically so that it couldn't be compared to The Nightingale. I was writing a domestic thriller. And at the time, there weren't that many. Gone Girl had come out, but Woman on a Train had not. So it was that time period. And it just turned out that I wasn't good at it. I just wasn't good at it. As much as I love reading thrillers, I couldn't write a good one. So I ended up throwing that whole book away after 2 years and just focusing on Alaska and the people of Alaska. And I picked the 70s because this was a couple of years ago, and the instability in America felt familiar to me, having lived through the 70s. It felt like we were going through something that I had seen before. And that's when the whole thing came together. And I love the Alaska part of that book. To tell everybody, I have no abuse in my family. That is not based on my father. And there's nothing, personal in that regard in the book, just my love for Alaska.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious that your character, Lenny, that character is so fun to see her, the courage that she shows and her growth. And I just wondered, was it difficult to write the scenes where, her father was so different, how it was like doing it to your own, your character?
It was really hard, and actually harder than writing Lenny was writing Cora. Writing the woman who stayed and the woman who, put up with this because, we all know factually that is what happens. And, it happens over and over and over. And I really wanted to delve into psychologically why. And I wanted that paired really well with this idea of the Vietnam vet who had come home with undiagnosed PTSD, because I remember as a preteen how we treated the Vietnam vets when they came home. And so I could understand, continuing to love somebody and want the best for them, even as he is unraveling. But as I was writing the book, it was so difficult not to have them just leave. Mm-hmm. But that's where the Alaskan landscape really helped, because there were so many months a year where they couldn't leave. So,
right. They were stuck there for sure. All right. Well, I'm curious, and I think our listeners would be curious too, if there's any sort of behind the scenes tidbits of your life that you would tell us about. What would surprise us the most of things that you enjoy or do? Hobbies.
Oh gosh, what would surprise you? I think I'm pretty quiet and introverted. I love all forms of water. I love being on the water. I love being by the water. I love swimming, surfing, paddleboarding. I love boating. I write longhand on yellow legal pads, and that's because I wrote half of Winter Garden sitting on the beach in Hawaii, and so maybe that's unusual.
Well, that's a different setting than you were writing about, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Kristin, I think I'd like to switch over and get some questions from our audience. I know they've been listening in. So for everyone listening in, remember you can still ask questions of Kristin. Just type them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll try really hard to get to as many of them as we can before 5. And so we'll switch over there. It'll take just a second to bring some of those questions up, I think. So one question that comes from Barb is that she says, I love the mother-daughter relationship in The Great Alone. Love the book so much. Can't wait to read it again. You lost your mom at a young age, as I did. Have you had the kind of, read that again. Haven't you kind of felt like a lost person since then? I guess what she's asking is, what has helped you to, get through that?
Well, as I said earlier, the relationship between me and my mom that lives in my head is continually playing out in my books. She is always in a book in some form. In The Great Alone, interestingly enough, I did base Cora on her. Cora looked like my mom. She dressed like my mom. She spoke like my mom. And there was this fragility to my mom that I explored, sort of through Cora. But of course, the real version of my mom is Mrs. Malarkey from Firefly Lane. But yeah, I think that any of us who lose their mothers young, you go on, you have a full life, you're happy, you raise your own kids, but there is a hole in you that you just don't ever get over. And there's a piece of you that it doesn't ever quite, I think, grow up the way you should, I guess is the best way to put it. Now when I see like my grandchildren, it just makes me sad all over again that my mother never met my son. And so there's a lot of moments like that, but I'm able to work through it in my work and share my grief with everybody. So,
well, it's helping other people with their grief as well, I'm sure. So
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, with Firefly Lane, now that's coming out as a series, right?
Yeah, it's Netflix has just a second, honey. What are you doing? You're on camera. Okay, my husband.
Hello.
Taking out the garbage.
Oh,
yeah, it's coming out from Netflix in November, and starring Katherine Heigl and Sarah Chalk. And I've seen it. It's great. It's bigger than the book. It's it's got a larger cast and more stuff going on. And I can't wait for people to see it. I think it's going to be out either the end of this year or early next year.
Great. So another question is, what is your advice for someone wanting to finally finish the elusive novel that's been sitting on the back burner?
Take it off the back burner and write every day if you can. When I started, obviously, when I wrote my my first probably 4 novels at least, I was an at-home mom with an infant and then a baby and then a toddler. And so I wrote those novels, most of them at an hour and a half a day during nap time. That's all I had. And so I know that you can learn to discipline yourself and just keep racking up pages, because that's what it takes. It's a button the seat, words on the page, kind of job. I think it's actually harder now, certainly with the pandemic, but harder in general because the internet now is so pervasive that we are bombarded with information and with emails and texts and all of this stuff all the time. And I think one of the skills that a writer needs to have is the ability to absolutely unplug and get away for whatever amount of time you have. And so if I would, like I said, get it off the back burner and just start writing every day. There is so much information online from like those master classes, and there's a lot of information and a lot of help and a lot of writer support groups. So I would say just keep writing and keep believing in it.
Okay, thank you. This question comes from Crystal. She says, as someone who lives in Alaska, I loved your portrayal of the rugged life, the beauty, and the hardships that come with life up here. Do you have a favorite place in Alaska?
I do have a favorite place in Alaska. It's basically, the easiest to say is Homer and Kachemak Bay, which is just stunningly beautiful. I based my town in the Great Alone, I can't now remember what it was called, on Soldovia, which is across the water from Homer. And then my father and my brother, through their company, the Great Alaska Adventure Lodge, have a place called Bear Camp, which is a fly-in camp where you can see bears in their natural habitat. And it's on Lake Clark, and I just think it is one of the most beautiful places in the world.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Cool. All right, this is a question from Deidre. What was your first book published?
Oh, my first book published was, interestingly, a book called A Handful of Heaven that took place during the Klondike Gold Rush and was set in Dawson City in the Yukon. So I guess I'm almost coming full circle here all these years later.
All right. Betsy asks, what were the 2 books you just read, mentioned at the beginning, that you really enjoyed? What were they?
Well, I'm sorry to tell you guys that neither one of them have been published yet. But I read 50 Words for Rain by Asha Lemmy, Asha is her first name, Lemmie, and Mark Sullivan's The Last Green Valley. Mark Sullivan wrote Beneath the Scarlet Sky, another big World War II book. So those two.
Nice. All right, this question comes from Hope. When you start writing, do you already have a storyline in mind, or does the story develop as you imagine the lives of the characters?
Yes. The way I work now is I usually research for about 8 months, sometimes a year, depending on how complex the time, place, and setting are. And during the time of all of that research, I have what I believe is my story. And I'm, fleshing out the world and figuring out what kind of woman lives there and what she would want and those sort of things. I always have a theme, in The Great Alone, it was survival, man against nature, man against man. And I do not begin writing until I know the last scene. I have to know the last scene of the novel. And so then I begin writing. And in the writing, I discover that everything I have done in the previous year is wrong. And I have only actually devised half a book. That's what always happens. Half of what I've come up with is right and half is wrong. And so then it becomes a process of following what I have to say and what the point of the book is, and sort of not being afraid to throw things away and take a different turn and try a different tact until I get to exactly the story that is somehow inside of me. It makes it sound like magic. It's not. It's just really hard work.
Yeah. How many drafts typically would you say you write?
I mean, easily 20. And like, for example, in the Nightingale, for the first entire year, there weren't two sisters. There was just one woman. It was Isabel's story. And I wrote the entire book as Isabel's story. And it wasn't until I got to the end that I thought, this isn't epic enough. It isn't big enough. There are other women's stories that need to be told. And so that's when I came up with her sister Vian. And then, of course, I had to come up with that relationship and her storyline and weave them all together and figure out what their past was. So, then it's on and on and on. And in my new book, The Four Winds, coming out in February, I ended up researching a novel for 20 years that covered a 20-year span. I wrote it and then decided that the last decade wasn't what I wanted to write about. So I cut off 350 pages and started over. So.
Wow. Yeah.
Slow going.
Right. Exactly. Well, so can you tell us a little bit about that novel? Are you able to leak a little bit about the story?
I'm kind of under an embargo, but I can share just a few little things. It's about a woman in Texas during the Great Depression whose husband abandons her in the worst of times, and she has to figure out how to save her children and keep them alive and keep food on the table during the Great Depression when 13 million people are out of work. And, like I said earlier, I had no idea that it would end up being as relevant as it is right now, with the joblessness and what's going on. And one of the things that's been great about it, having done so much research about another one of America's really dark times, is the knowledge that and the reminder that history grants us that we have been in dark times before, and we will survive, and the message, I think, of the Great Depression is, we need to band together, not drift apart. We, to be our strongest selves as Americans, we need to fight for common goals and a common future as opposed to a splintered one. So that's the four wins.
Great. It makes me wonder, though, that so many of your characters are scrappy women who really figure out how to save themselves and save their families. Does it give you any sense that by writing about it and researching about it, you're ready for things that might come to you that might be difficult?
I'm constantly asking myself, what could I do? What would I do? That obviously the sharpest example of that question is the Nightingale, where, you're enemy occupied. And the question for me on that one was, when would I put my son's life at risk? And so I think those are, you asked earlier about why World War, why Great Depression, why all these big times. It's because those questions are on the table. And I find them fascinating. And I think that so much of women's history and women's strength has been marginalized and looked over by historians. And it's important for young women now, millennials, to see how powerful women have been throughout history, how durable we are, how able we are to stand up for ourselves and solve our own problems and lead the charge. And so that's my soapbox, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So another question is, what has been the most influential book that you have read in the last year or in recent times?
Well, the one that comes to me at the moment, of course, given the world that we're in right now, is Between the World and Me by Coates, and it's a remarkable, I guess, meditation on race and fatherhood in America, and I thought it was just really powerful. There's another one called Homegoing by Yaagasi, Yaagasi, I think. And so I think I've been, focused on reading about race in the last, couple of weeks. And I think that's a really important first step that a lot of us can take.
Tommy asks, I was wondering what your biggest inspiration for writing is. Where do you find your ideas?
Oh, the big question. My ideas come from the world around me, in large part. They come from wanting to explore, at the moment, women's history and people surviving hard times, how families hold together, how they stay together. I'm always looking for a story that has always been out there but hasn't been told. And so I guess that's my inspiration. And then my goal in my stories is to both educate and entertain, and ultimately to make history or an issue or a moment really come alive for somebody, so it makes you feel like you were there and you would say to yourself, could I survive that? Could I do that? What would I do? How would I survive?
What are some of the qualities that you would say are important for a budding novelist? So we know that getting the words down is one, but what are some other things that would help?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, you have to be a reader. You have to read a lot of things. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of only reading the kind of books that they think they want to write. And I think you need to really open yourself up to the whole experience and read genres that you wouldn't usually read or books that make you uncomfortable. I think you can learn an awful lot from the classics, the kind of books that, we were assigned in college. And so I think that's, very important reading. And then you have to learn the craft. Writing a novel is an art, I suppose, but it's also a craft, and crafts can be learned. So you have to put the time in, not unlike becoming a lawyer or a dentist, a doctor, whatever. You have to put the time in and learn what you're doing. And you have to sort of check your ego at the door and understand that part of writing is everyone will have an opinion and will tell you if you've done it well. And if you get lucky, people you don't even know will tell you if you've done it well. And so you really have to find that place in yourself where you're willing to take the hits and try to get better.
Thank you. This question comes from Taylor, who says, regarding race, do you think you will ever write characters who may be Black, Indigenous, people of color? And is there any kind of, is it difficult to do that if one isn't of that race?
Well, one of the primary characters in The Great Alone was Black. But it's a tricky question in the world right now. And I certainly can't say that I wouldn't, but I would have to be exceptionally well-informed, and I would have to be certain that I could do justice to the story that I was trying to tell.
Okay, we have one last question, which is, what was your reaction when you found out The Nightingale would be made into a movie? And do you immediately think of any actresses who might play Isabelle or Vian? They don't let the author make that choice, though, do they?
No, they don't let the author make that choice. Obviously, I was super excited when it sold. But I've also, my husband's in the movie business, and so I've been around the movie business for a long time. And I know that it's a long, slow process, and there are a lot of steps to go through. So, getting optioned is one step along the way, but it's a long way from there to seeing it on your screen. And with regard to actresses, I'm trying to think who I saw back then. And the problem I have is when I have characters in my head that are, say, 25 or 30, they tend to be people who are now 50. But I remember them when they were 30. And so that's who I see in my head. So I can't actually remember who I wanted to play Isabelle and Vian.
Yeah. Well, they came up with a couple of real winners with the Fanning sisters, for sure.
They did. And the one thing that I particularly love about The Nightingale is that we have a female director, a female writer, female leads, and a female studio head. And so it is definitely, a girl power kind of movie, which is exciting.
That is cool. Will you get to visit the set at all, do you think?
Well, I was supposed to be, there in April of this year. So I don't know. It depends.
Yeah.
Depends.
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, Kristin, I think we're at the end of our time, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a treat. We've appreciated your time and your thoughts. So to everyone, remember Kristin's books are available on both Overdrive and Hoopla services. So check them out at ncrl.org. And this evening's program is part of our NCRL Virtual Reads Author Series. So join us this Thursday, June 25th at 4 p.m. to hear from National Geographic Adventurer of the Year, Heather Anderson. And upcoming authors include Peter Heller, Chanel Clayton, Blake Crouch, and Gemma Aluo. Check out our website, ncrl.org, for more info, and like us on Facebook to stay up to date. So we really hope that everyone had just a wonderful time this evening. I know I did. And again, thank you so much, Kristin, for your generous time that you gave us today.
Well, thank you so much. It was really great. And I look forward to getting back to Wenatchee and seeing you all in person very soon.
Excellent. All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.